Hi there, I'm Matt Stagg and I'm the Modernised Assets and Integration Specialist for Southern Rural Water, and I'm also lucky enough to have the job of Chief Remote Pilot. Southern Rural Water manages 3 main irrigation districts, as well as the regulation of surface water, groundwater licences and storage dams across the southern third of Victoria. We service an area covering 88,000 square kilometres, or 37% of Victoria, stretching from the South Australian border to the New South Wales border at Mallacoota. This water is primarily used for agriculture, but also for urban and industrial purposes. We run Victoria's largest groundwater operation and second largest non-metropolitan headworks business. So how did we end up using drones? Well, around 2 years ago, I began using drones as a way of tracking stage completion on some of our major projects and assessing large land areas for upcoming construction, as well as taking some nice photos of some of the big impressive infrastructure that Southern Rural Water manage, like the Glen Maggie Weir that you can see behind me. From those humble beginnings, Southern Rural Water now uses drones in a number of other purposes across our whole service area and across multiple departments, and we're exploring new and innovative ways to improve business practices using these technologies. We've also now got around 10 people trained in drone operations across the business. In this 2-part video series, I'm going to discuss the types of drones and the legal requirements to fly them in Australia, uses for drones in utilities businesses and how they can improve productivity, safety and your business profile, as well as the actionable outputs that drone technology provides. And I'll try to cover some of the pitfalls and considerations for businesses when establishing a drone program in Australia, and what to expect in terms of cost and resource time. So I'm going to start by discussing the classifications of drones and some of the legal considerations to operating drones in a utility business. Drones, like the ones you see beside me, are often referred to as UAVs, which stands for Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. Or sometimes they're called RPAS, which stands for Remotely Piloted Aerial Systems. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go too deeply into the specifications of each of these drones, but I will discuss their categories, some uses and some limitations to some extent. When it comes to aerial drones, they can be loosely divided into 3 main categories. The first is multi-rotor under 2 kg. This is the most commonly seen drone type. Users in Australia currently aren't required to hold a licence for this type of drone, although there are strict operating requirements, and they're relatively inexpensive compared to some of the other types. This one is a DJI Phantom 4 Pro. It has a 20 megapixel camera, takes 4K video footage, all gimbal stabilised, and has dual GPS sensors. It's exceptionally easy to fly. These ones are pretty common to see, but there's also a number of other choices in this category from other manufacturers such as GoPro, Untitled and Parrot. The major drawbacks of this type of drone are their limited camera operations, lack of redundancy and some instability in windy weather. Though this is improving with multiple gyro and GPS equipped drones in clever control software like what this DJI Phantom Pro has. I'll just quickly touch on some of the legal requirements to fly a drone under 2 kg in Australia. Civil Aviation Safety Authority sets rules that sub 2 kg UAVs must operate under. These include not at an altitude higher than 120 metres or 400 feet above the natural ground level, not within 30 metres of a person not associated with the drone operations or not above mobile operating plant equipment, not directly over a populous area, which is a risk-based assessment defined by the likelihood of injury or property damage if the drone were to fall out of the sky. Not at night. And they must remain within unaided visual line of sight. That means you can't use binoculars to keep an eye on the drone while it's up in the sky. This is pretty important and a reason that you should use a spotter if you're doing operations where you may lose sight of the drone. You can't fly in an area defined as a restricted flight zone, such as a Sydney Harbour, and you must hold an ARN number, or an aviation reference number, issued by CASA and advised 5 days prior to your first commercial flight. So the next category is multi-rotor over 2 kg. These drones offer far more versatility with regard to camera operations, with quick detachable cameras and differing lenses, as well as opening up access to a range of specialty cameras such as thermal cameras and high zoom. Some models can even be controlled by 2 operators simultaneously, like the Inspire 1 that you can see on the end of the table there, where one pilot will control the drone itself and another pilot will control the camera only. They can also offer other levels of redundancy and extra safety features such as multiple batteries on some of the larger models and extra motors and rotors with the ability to fly even if a motor or a rotor becomes disabled or a battery drops out. Some can even carry payloads and other equipment like spray units. The drawbacks of these larger multi-rotors though is often their cost, though this is improving as more become available, and also the licensing requirements, which we'll talk about shortly. The final category, which Southern Raw Water doesn't operate yet, is fixed-wing drones. Fixed-wing drones have been most useful in the surveying and agricultural sort of industries, but they're starting to pop up in mining a lot more. They generally have fixed downward-facing cameras, often with multiple sensors for things like infrared, near-infrared, thermal, LiDAR and other purposes. The advantages are that they offer long flight time. They're able to cover huge areas in a single flight, and they're relatively quiet compared to some of these other drones since most of them only run a single motor. Most often these drones fly automated, predetermined flight paths using special software to gather large amounts of data and images and then land by themselves. Despite the software automating the flight of these drones, they do currently require licenses to operate in Australia, and there are some restrictions around line of sight. Currently fixed-wing drones are a lot less common, mainly due to their high cost, limited operational capability and more bulky packaging. But expect that to change over the next few years. It'll become less and less of a restricting factor as they become cheaper, smaller and more capable with more or multiple different tiles of camera and new flight modes. As I mentioned with the drones over 2 kg and the fixed-wing drones, they both currently require licenses to fly within Australia. The license that I'm referring to is known as an REPL, or Remote Pilot's License. There's lots of acronyms in this video, I'm sorry about that. In Australia, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, C-A-S-A, is the regulatory authority for the drone sector. There are a couple of endorsements under the REPL license to consider as well. These include multi-rotor up to 7 kg, so that's over 2 kg up to 7 kg, multi-rotor up to 25 kg, and fixed wing up to 7 kg being the most common. Anything beyond 25 kg you start getting into the area of airships, which is a whole other thing altogether. A good number of training providers offer courses all around Australia for REPL licenses. Generally this involves either a 5 to 6 day training course face-to-face, or a 2 to 3 day online theory course and a face-to-face exam with flight training, which might take another 2 or 3 days. Usually during this training, the trainee will also gain an AROC, or Aeronautical Radio Operator Certification, which allows them to use airband radios in Australia. These courses can cost anywhere between $1,200 and $2,500 depending on the endorsements offered, and many training companies will offer discounts or come-to-you style training for larger groups. For businesses, there's some further requirements from CASA to gain what's called an ROC, or Remote Operations Certification. To gain this certification, CASA require that the business has suitable policies, procedures and manuals, as well as safe working methods. The Operational Procedures Manual will need to contain all of the detail around safety, drone details, and flight authorization forms, operating conditions and privacy management. CASA will then also require a phone interview with the Chief Remote Pilot, which includes a verbal exam on theory and procedures. There is a cost involved in this process, and it can range anywhere up to $3,000, but a number of the training providers mentioned previously will offer to create the manuals, create the procedures, and train the Chief Remote Pilot ready for the interview. So that's something you might want to consider. Also worth mentioning is that all operators and the business itself will need to register for an ARN number, or Aviation Reference Number, with CASA. This is basically like a customer number for your dealings with CASA, and you need to quote it every time you contact CASA so they can look up your previous details and interactions. This process is free. Application forms can be downloaded on the CASA website, and I'll put a link down in the video description. For businesses operating drones, separate to all the licensing requirements, another important consideration that you might have to think about is whether your business insurance will cover their use, or whether you'll need to seek alternate insurance options. If you use an insurance broker, it's worth giving them a call regarding this. It's one thing that we found was something we didn't identify until we'd already started down the road of drones. Fortunately, we were covered by our current insurance, but it's worth making the inquiry with your broker or your insurance agency. So then, your business has selected the drones, you've obtained the relevant licensing and registrations, and you've chosen and trained your operators. So you're ready to start exploring some of these uses for the new technology. As I mentioned earlier, Southern Rural Water began using drones mostly as a visual information and recording tool. In this video, I'm going to cover a number of those categories. They're going to include media and communications, construction overview, land assessments, audit verification images, operations and maintenance manuals, and a little bit on compliance imagery. In part 2, or video 2, I'll be discussing more detailed use cases for drones, which will include surveying and small-scale, high-detail mapping for things like GIS, thermal imagery capability and its uses in the utilities businesses, and 3D modelling and things like point clouds, which can be generated using drones. So I'm going to start with media, comms and engagement. In some ways this is the most powerful and yet some of the simplest imagery to gather with drones. Everything from images of structures and work sites to project and construction images, case studies and even team photos can be quickly gathered by one person with a low-cost drone. These are great not only for the general public and publication for traditional media like television and even social media, but also for customer, community and stakeholder engagement. It's much easier to enrol someone in a plan or a project when they can really see what you're talking about. This becomes particularly important where stakeholders in your projects or your business may not always be in the region of your projects. These context visuals can really lift your case studies and your projects and really give a great overview of how your customers operate using your business. And not forgetting how useful they can be for internal purposes too, keeping non-project staff informed about what's going on around the business or what's happening in the progress of a particular project. This ties almost directly into the next category, which is construction overview, which is where a project group or a maintenance team might need to give a project control group or a management group an update on progress. For those customers and stakeholders most directly affected, keeping them engaged from a project through to completion is much easier when you can show them exactly what's planned, exactly what's being done, and give some general context on the scale of the tasks, as well as reasons for different options and decisions. We utilise these first two types of imagery to great effect at Southern Rural Water and probably the most, and it's really helped build the profile of our works, our business, and convey the scale of what we're doing to our customer group simply and effectively. The next category is land assessment. Land assessment is used primarily in the project planning stage, but it can also be used by environmental teams for things like land value assessments, cultural heritage likelihood assessments. It can be included in tenders, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's really helpful in understanding obstacles and other planning considerations in your projects, such as sheds that might be in the way, or buildings, parking areas, machinery access, all sorts of things like that. Images in this category can also be used to provide with tender documents to help potential tenderers understand all of the above when providing quotes for works. This can result in less likelihood of variations later, as your tenderers know exactly what's there, and they can then provide a more accurate tender pricing submission. Such images could also be useful in the business case stage of a project, where you need to show the condition of infrastructure to be replaced, or the proposed works area in the funding application, or in the feasibility stage. Audit verification images are useful on large-scale construction projects, particularly where there may be a requirement for external auditors to undertake things like water savings or benefits realisation audits. Southern Rural Water uses such images to show before and after of our irrigation delivery systems as modernisation goes about the process of replacing channels with pipelines. Because the images taken with a drone like the Phantom 4 are geolocated or GPS positioned, it's pretty easy to take images from the same location looking in the same direction before and after the works, and you can even plot these images and their locations on a GPS map or a GIS map for verification purposes, which can be really handy. For assets-based and large utilities industries such as water, power, rail, local roads and council authorities, drones offer huge potentials in assets inspections, particularly where assets like ours are often large, difficult or unsafe to access and spread out geographically. When we consider access to some of these sites, drones can offer significant safety benefits and time savings, where a single operator can gather imagery of an asset in minutes using a drone, as opposed to a couple of hours or even days for manual inspections. An example is our Headworks dam inspections, like Glenmaggie here behind me. Previous methods can involve rigging up operators in abseiling gear or putting them in a man box lowered by a crane over the wall of the structure, or, on the upstream side, approaching the wall in a boat, but that only works when the water conditions allow, just to gather inspection data and take photos of things. We can now use drones to fly within a metre of the structure safely and take high resolution imagery in minutes, saving cost in time and planning and execution. Not to mention the reduction of risk that this offers by not having to send anyone over the edge of a wall 70 metres above the ground. Using the drone, it's also possible to program repeatable flight paths. This takes all the subjectivity out of your images gathered and also allows you to build a visual database of your assets over time. This combination of risk mitigation and time and cost saving is proving to make drones a no-brainer for businesses like Southern Rural Water. With the initial small cost of a Phantom 4 like this, which you'll pay anywhere up to $3,000 depending on your accessories, it can repay itself in months. Similarly to land assessment imagery, we use drones to gather imagery for O&M manuals to provide a unique opportunity to show otherwise difficult areas to access or to explain parts of a site or structure on a large scale. The images you're looking at were used in an O&M manual for another one of our sites, which is visited very infrequently. From images like this, operators can quickly familiarise themselves with the site, the components, access, and some of the hazards presented at the site. Southern Rural Water has also in the last couple of years began offering a service creating O&M manuals and procedures, as well as offering dam inspection and assessment services for other authorities. Our drones have since been integrated into the process a few times, not just as a value add tool, but as an important explanatory and context building tool within these documents. Our final category that we're going to touch on is compliance imagery. When we talk about compliance imagery in a rural water sense, it's usually regarding someone taking unfair advantage of water. Whether this is taking the water through an outlet without authority, or just outright stealing it using an illegal pump site, using the drones we're able to find and photograph these illegal pump sites, which are often hidden along our rivers and channels. It can also be used to document unauthorised works to our assets, such as crossings over channels that don't have authority to be there, or pipes that cause obstruction to the channel's network themselves. Water is a finite resource that Southern Rural Water is tasked with managing fairly on behalf of all of our customers. But likewise in other industries, compliance forms an important part of ensuring the security of your asset network. Drones can be a really useful tool in ensuring the ongoing reliability and compliance of your network into the future. So that brings us to the end of our first video. Hopefully this has provided some useful insights for your business into using drones and what's involved in starting up your own drone program, as well as an introduction to some of the basic outputs that can be quickly obtained using this technology. For more information, feel free to contact me via email at matts@srw.com.au. Be sure to check out our next video, where we'll be exploring some of the more detailed and powerful uses for drones and utilities. And of course, be sure to leave us a comment down below and a like if you found this video useful. I'm Stagg with Southern Rural Water. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.